This is the story of the Battle of Tolvajärvi, specifically the bizarre and legendary Sausage War, Makkarasota, a moment where the freezing hunger of the Red Army collided with the desperate defiance of the Finnish Sisu. The frost and the flame, the legend of the Sausage War. The silence of the Finnish forest wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, like a shroud. In December 1939, the air in Karelia didn't just feel cold, it felt like a physical weight, a crystalline pressure that turned breath into ice and spirit into brittle glass. At minus 40 degrees Celsius, the world stops moving. Metal sticks to skin, oil turns to sludge, and the only thing cheaper than human life is the ammunition used to end it. Stalin's Red Army had expected a parade. They thought they would march into Helsinki in 2 weeks, cheered by a liberated working class. Instead, they found a nightmare of white shadows. They found the Sisu. But on the night of December 10, 1939, the fate of the Finnish line didn't hang on a tactical genius or a new weapon. It hung on the smell of a hot meal. This is the story of how a pot of pork sausage prevented a Soviet breakthrough and changed the course of the Winter War. Part 1. The Red Tide and the White Hell. The invasion had begun with a roar of artillery that shook the earth, but 10 days later, the Soviet 139th Division was struggling. They were deep in the broken terrain of Tolvajärvi, a region of jagged lakes and dense pines. The Soviet soldiers were exhausted. Many had been brought from the warm climates of Ukraine and the Caucasus, dressed in thin olive-drab overcoats that offered as much protection as a wet newspaper against the Finnish winter. They were hungry. The Soviet supply lines, stretched thin across single-track logging roads, were being devoured by Finnish mutti tactics, ghost-like skiers who would emerge from the trees, blow up a field kitchen, and vanish before the snow settled. On the other side stood Colonel Paavo Talvela and his ragtag group of Finnish defenders. They were outnumbered 5-1. They had no tanks, they had very little artillery. What they had was a deep ancestral knowledge of the woods and a terrifying proficiency with the Suomi KP-31 submachine gun. Part 2. The Midnight Infiltration. By the evening of December 10, 1939, the situation was dire. A Soviet regiment had managed to slip through the Finnish lines under the cover of a blinding snowstorm. Their objective was simple: get behind the Finnish 16th Infantry Regiment, cut the supply road, and encircle the defenders. If they succeeded, the Finnish front at Tolvajärvi would collapse. The road to the interior of Finland would be wide open. The Soviets moved like a dark bruise across the white landscape. They were silent, driven by the desperation of men who knew that if they didn't win soon, they would simply freeze to death where they stood. They reached the Finnish rear camps around midnight. The Finns were caught off guard. Supply clerks, cooks, and exhausted reserves scrambled for their rifles as the dark shapes of Soviet infantry emerged from the tree line, bayonets gleaming in the moonlight. Part 3. The Scent of Temptation. The Soviet troops were on the verge of a total tactical victory. They had overrun the initial perimeter, but as they pushed into the heart of the Finnish camp, something happened that no general could have predicted. In the center of the camp, several large field kitchens were simmering. The Finnish cooks had been preparing a massive, calorie-dense stew for the frontline troops, rich, fatty pork sausage soup. For the Soviet soldiers, who had been living on frozen bread rations and melted snow for days, the smell was an assault on their senses. It was more powerful than any propaganda, more compelling than any command from a commissar. The Red Army soldiers didn't just stop, they broke. The discipline that had carried them across the border vanished. Men dropped their Mosin-Nagant rifles. They ignored the shouts of their officers. They swarmed the bubbling cauldrons, scooping out chunks of fatty meat with their bare hands, burning their throats as they gulped down the life-giving fat. In that moment, the war didn't matter. Communism didn't matter. Only the sausage mattered. Part 4. The Counterattack of the Shadows. This sausage intermission gave the Finns the one thing they desperately needed: time. Colonel Talvila, hearing of the breakthrough, didn't panic. He gathered a scratch force of every able-bodied man he could find. This included clerks, wounded men who could still pull a trigger, and the legendary Finnish ski patrols. While the Soviet troops were hunched over the soup pots, the Finns surrounded the camp. What followed was a brutal, chaotic, close-quarters slaughter. The Finnish troops used the Suomi submachine guns to devastating effect. In the confined space of the camp, the high rate of fire turned the snow red. The Soviet troops, caught between the bliss of a full stomach and the reality of a Finnish ambush, had no time to recover their weapons. It was a massacre in the moonlight. By dawn, the sausage war was over. Hundreds of Soviet bodies lay around the emptied cauldrons, and the breakthrough had completely been repelled. The aftermath. The ghost of Tolvajärvi. The Battle of Tolvajärvi would continue for several more days, eventually becoming the first major Finnish victory of the war. It proved to the world and to the Soviets that the Red Army was not invincible. It gave the Finnish people the hope they needed to hold out for months against impossible odds. But in the annals of military history, it is that one night, the night of the Sausage War, that remains the most surreal. It serves as a grim reminder of the primal realities of war, that sometimes the greatest enemy isn't a bullet or a bomb, but the simple, desperate hunger of a man lost in the cold. Part 5. The Iron Will of Talvila. On the morning of December 12, 1939, the sun rose, if you could call it that. In the Finnish winter, the sun is a pale, sickly ghost that hugs the horizon for a few hours before vanishing. Colonel Talvila was under immense pressure. The Mannerheim line in the south was holding, but here in the central wilderness, a Soviet breakthrough would allow the Red Army to swing behind the Finnish defenses and cut the country in half. His superior, Marshal Mannerheim, had given him a simple, impossible order: attack. Talvila was a man of fire and brimstone. He believed that the only way to beat a larger force was to never let them breathe. He turned to his trusted subordinate, Lieutenant Colonel Aaro Pajari, a man who had already suffered a heart attack during the early days of the fighting, but refused to leave the front. Talvila told him, "We don't just hold Tolvajärvi, we take the lake." Between the two armies lay the frozen expanse of Lake Tolvajärvi. It was a kill zone, a flat white desert of ice with no cover. The Soviets held the high ground on the opposite shore, dug into the thick stone buildings of a tourist hotel and the surrounding woods. Pajari's plan was suicidal. He decided to send his men directly across the ice. At the crack of dawn, the Finnish artillery, what little they had, opened fire. It wasn't a massive bombardment the Soviets were used to. It was precise, surgical. Then, out of the tree line came the Finnish army. They didn't march, they moved with the eerie, fluid grace of professional skiers. The Soviet 139th Division opened up with everything they had. Maxim machine guns chattered, cutting lines into the snow. But the Finns used a tactic the Soviets couldn't replicate: the Sisu charge. They utilized small islands as stepping stones, leapfrogging under heavy fire.
Part 7. The Siege of the Tourist Hotel. The centerpiece of the Soviet defense was a large, modern hotel perched on a hill overlooking the lake. It had been built for summer travelers, but now its windows bristled with Soviet light machine guns. As Pajari's men reached the shore, the battle turned into a nightmare of room-to-room fighting. This wasn't the gentlemanly warfare of the previous century. This was knives in the dark, grenades tossed into basements, and the terrifying spray of the Suomi submachine guns. One Finnish soldier, later interviewed, described the scene. The hallways were so narrow you couldn't miss. You didn't aim, you just felt the vibration of the gun until the shadow in front of you stopped moving. The smell of burnt powder and frozen blood is something you never wash off. By the afternoon, the hotel was a charred husk, and the Soviet line had broken. The 139th Division, a force of over 20,000 men, began to crumble under the pressure of just 5,000 Finns. Part 8. The Rout and the Moti. The retreat of the Red Army was not an organized withdrawal, it was a panicked flight. They abandoned their tanks, their heavy trucks, and their precious field kitchens. They retreated toward the village of Tolvajärvi, but the Finns were already there. This is where the world first learned the word moti. In Finnish, moti refers to a cord of firewood, wood that is cut, stacked, and marked for later use. This is exactly what the Finnish ski troops did to the Soviet columns. Using their superior mobility on skis, the Finns would strike the center of a long Soviet convoy, blowing up the lead and rear vehicles. The Soviet troops, trapped on narrow forest roads with deep snow on either side, were stuck. They were stacked into small pockets, motis. The Finns didn't rush in to finish them. They waited. They stayed in the shadows, sniping the officers, destroying the heaters, and making sure no food reached the trapped men. The Soviet soldiers were left with a choice: freeze, starve, or wait for the Suomi submachine guns to find them in the night. Part 9. The Psychological Toll. The Sausage War incident had been a symptom of a deeper rot in the Soviet campaign: logistics. Stalin had prepared for a war of ideology, but he hadn't prepared for a war of biology. As the remnants of the 139th Division fled east, they left behind a trail of snow statues, Soviet soldiers who had sat down to rest for a moment and never stood back up, frozen solid in haunting, lifelike poses. For the Finnish soldiers, the victory at Tolvajärvi was a shot of pure adrenaline. They had proven that the red steamroller could be cracked. They had captured dozens of tanks, hundreds of machine guns, and enough ammunition to keep the war going for another month. The saga continues. The victory at Tolvajärvi was the first spark, but the fire was spreading. While Talvela was securing the lakes, further north, another, even more legendary conflict was brewing in the dark forests of Suomussalmi. There, an entire Soviet Army Corps was marching into a trap that would become the greatest military disaster in USSR history. And in the middle of it all, a small, unassuming man with a bolt-action rifle was beginning his hunt. His name was Simo Häyhä, and the Soviets would soon call him the White Death. Part 10. The Rate Road Trap. The 44th Division was a proud unit. Freshly arrived from Ukraine, they were well equipped with tanks, trucks, and heavy artillery. Their mission was to link up with the 163rd Division at the village of Suomussalmi and march all the way to the Gulf of Bothnia, effectively cutting Finland in half. But the Finns had a different plan. Led by Hjalmar Siosvuo, the Finnish forces utilized the dense forest as their greatest weapon. They didn't meet the massive Soviet column head-on. Instead, they moved like ghosts through the waist-deep snow, parallel to the road. As the Soviet column stretched out for nearly 20 miles along the single narrow Rate road, the Finns struck. They blew up bridges and blocked the road with fallen trees at both ends. Suddenly, 20,000 men and thousands of vehicles were trapped in a long, thin line. Part 11. Breaking the Serpent. This was the birth of the moti on a grand scale. Siasuo's men didn't attack the whole column at once. They used their skis to slice the long serpent into smaller segments. Imagine being a Soviet soldier in that column. You're sitting in a truck, the engine stalling because the oil has turned to thick paste. The temperature drops to -45 degrees Celsius. You haven't had a hot meal in days because every time a field kitchen starts a fire, a Finnish sniper's bullet puts it out. You can't see the enemy. You only hear the hiss of skis on snow and the occasional thud of a mortar. One by one, the Finnish Sisu units isolated these pockets. They would destroy the Soviet radio trucks first, leaving each segment blind and unable to communicate with their officers. Part 12. The White Death emerges. While the 44th Division was being carved up on the Rate Road, a few miles away at the Kola River, a man named Simo Häyhä was beginning a career that would make him the most lethal sniper in human history. Simo was a hunter and a farmer. He was barely 5 feet tall. He didn't use a telescopic sight because the glass would fog in the cold or reflect the sun, giving away his position. He used simple iron sights on his M28-30 rifle. He would pack the snow in front of him so the blast of his rifle wouldn't kick up a cloud of powder. He would keep snow in his mouth so his breath wouldn't steam in the freezing air. To the Soviet soldiers, he wasn't a man. He was a vengeful spirit of the forest. In just 100 days, Simo Häyhä would record over 500 confirmed kills. The Red Army sent entire platoons just to find him. They called in counter-snipers and carpet-bombed areas where they thought he was hiding. Simo simply waited, breathed through the snow, and continued to pull the trigger. Part 13. The Night of the Screams. Back on the Rate Road, the end was near. By early January 1940, the 44th Division was a collection of walking corpses. They were out of fuel, out of food, and nearly out of ammunition. The Finns launched their final assault under the cover of a massive blizzard. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. Finnish ski troops swept through the pockets with Suomi submachine guns and Puukko knives. The Soviet tanks, unable to turn in the narrow road or see through the snow, were helpless. Finns would ski right up to them and drop satchel charges or Molotov cocktails onto the engine decks.
The road became a graveyard of twisted metal and frozen men. When the battle finally ended, the Finns captured 43 tanks, 71 field guns, 260 trucks, 1,170 horses, enough small arms to equip 2 entire Finnish brigades. Part 14. The world takes notice. The news of the miracle at Suomussalmi and the sausage war at Tolvajärvi flashed across the globe. For the first time, the Western world realized that the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay. In the United States, the headlines screamed about the sturdy Finns and the White Death. Volunteers from across the globe began to head toward Finland. But the victory came at a heavy price. The Finns were running out of men, while Stalin had millions more to throw into the meat grinder. The Soviets were humiliated. Stalin, in a fit of rage, ordered his generals to stop the amateur tactics and bring in the heavy hitters. The Red Army was about to change its strategy, moving away from forest infiltration and toward a brutal, primitive display of sheer, overwhelming power. Part 15. The Duel of the White Shadows. By mid-January, the Soviet command was desperate to eliminate the Finnish sniper, who was single-handedly demoralizing an entire division. They didn't just send infantry anymore, they sent their best. A specialized team of Soviet elite snipers was dispatched to the Kola front with one mission: find the man in the white mask and bring back his head. These were not the shivering conscripts from the sausage incident. These were seasoned hunters from the Urals, equipped with the best optics the USSR could produce. Simo knew they were coming. He could feel the change in the woods, the way the birds didn't settle, the way the silence felt sharper. For 3 days, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the sub-zero brush. Simo stayed motionless for hours, his body becoming part of a snowdrift. He used no scope, relying on iron sights to keep his profile low. On the 3rd day, a Soviet sniper made a fatal mistake. A slight glint of sunlight caught his telescopic lens for a fraction of a second. Simo didn't hesitate. 1 shot, 1 kill. The counter-sniper team was neutralized before they even knew Simo's true position. Part 16, the Steel Storm, breaking the Mannerheim Line. While Simo held the line at Kola, the Soviet High Command, led by Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, decided to abandon finesse. They realized that forest skirmishes and sausage war traps were losing them the war. They pivoted to the steamroller. In February 1940, the Soviets concentrated nearly 600,000 men and 4,000 tanks against the Mannerheim Line, the main Finnish defensive strip across the Karelian Isthmus. The bombardment that followed was the heaviest since the Battle of Verdun in World War I. For days, the earth literally liquidized under the weight of Soviet shells. The Finnish soldiers lived in Sisu holes, crude bunkers and trenches carved into the frozen ground. They were deafened, concussed, and buried alive, yet every time the Soviet tanks surged forward, the ghosts in white would emerge from the craters to meet them. Part 17. The 100-Day Miracle ends. Despite the staggering victories at Tolvajärvi and Derailed, the math of war began to catch up. Finland was a nation of 3.7 million people, fighting a superpower of 170 million. The Finns were running out of everything: artillery shells, medical supplies, and most importantly, men. By March, the Mannerheim Line had finally been breached. The Finnish army was exhausted, some units having fought for 90 days straight without a single night of rest in a warm bed. On March 6, 1940, the legend of the White Death nearly came to a permanent end. During a chaotic firefight, an explosive Soviet bullet struck Simo in the lower jaw. The bullet blew off half his face. His comrades dragged his limp body back, believing he was dead. As they threw him on a pile of casualties, one soldier noticed a leg twitch. He's still alive! Simo regained consciousness on March 13th, the very day the peace treaty was signed. Part 18. The Bitter Peace. The Moscow Peace Treaty was a jagged pill for the Finns to swallow. They had won almost every major battle, humiliated the Red Army, and captured more equipment than they had started with, yet they were forced to cede 11% of their territory, including their second-largest city, Viipuri. Over 400,000 Finns, the entire population of the ceded lands, chose to leave their homes and move into the remaining Finnish territory rather than live under Soviet rule. They burned their own houses and killed their livestock so the Soviets would inherit nothing but ashes and cold wind. Epilogue. The Legacy of the Sausage and the Snow. The sausage war at Tolvajärvi and the subsequent slaughter at Derailed were more than just military trivia. They changed the world. 1. Hitler's miscalculation. Watching the Red Army struggle against tiny Finland, Hitler became convinced that the Soviet Union was a rotting shack that would collapse with one kick. This overconfidence led him to launch Operation Barbarossa just over a year later. 2. Soviet reform. The humiliation forced Stalin to modernize the Red Army, bringing back professional ranks and better winter training, reforms that eventually allowed them to defeat Nazi Germany. 3. The spirit of Sisu. To this day, the Battle of Tolvajärvi remains a symbol of the underdog. It proved that a motivated force fighting for their homes with nothing but Sisu and a few pots of sausage soup could stand against a titan. Simo Häyhä lived to be 96 years old. When asked in his final years if he regretted the lives he took during those 100 days of white hell, he simply replied, "I did what I was told to do as well as I could."